Well, hello everyone. It is September and I'm enjoying my annual fall holidays up in the bush, and it's been a good day. Very quiet. It's a little after 4 p.m. and it's been a good day. Really dead silent once I got up where I'm going. I don't normally come up on a weekend, and this is a weekend day. And the reason I did that is because I haven't been to this particular area since last year. And I know there have been a lot of industry in the area, so I wasn't sure if I was going to run into anybody. I haven't quite got the radio solution sorted out for my truck in terms of a two-way radio. So I didn't want to come up on a weekday and potentially have an issue with industry on some of these roads. Most of them are okay, as long as you drive sane, you keep your headlights on, and you're kind of ready to duck out of the way, because there are some hiking trails on this Forest Service road, at least down in the valley. And there's even a provincial park or whatever, a couple of them actually. So there are recreational users up here. It's not like some roads. You know, there's a few roads in British Columbia that are pretty famous. One in particular is Gorge Road. And that one is sort of, you know, I mean, you can find it on the internet, right? Known for, you know, some accidents and some close calls and some scares, because there's areas of that road that are very narrow, and those guys come through there like they're hell-bent for leather. They are flying, the logging trucks. That creates a dangerous situation, especially if you have a somewhat less than savvy, you know, recreational user. That is still nice and hot. No, there's no Tim Hortons up here. Just a good thermos. So that's wonderful, you know, when you're after 4 p.m. and the coffee's still hot. So that's enjoyable. You know, as far as a topic for today, I guess really, for the last 5 years or so, I would say I have been a little bit more at disharmony with the logging industry than I had been in the past. You know, when I discovered some of the areas that I like to go to, and keep in mind, I grew up in this general area, so I've been to a lot of these parts almost my entire life. You know, we've been in Canada in this area since I was about 6 years old. And so I've spent my entire life up in the Canadian wilderness, and we were somewhat semi-remote. We were quite rural, you know, or semi-remote, you know, however you want to say it. We certainly didn't have any running water, electricity, telephone, any of that. Root cellar we had, kerosene lanterns, and a pump outside of our house to get water. That sort of infrastructure, right? And as a young adult, up until again about 5 years ago, I've been relatively at harmony with the logging industry. I even worked in the logging industry in the early to mid 80s. And you know, these were generally back then smaller operations, often families. The logging operation that I worked for was a pair of brothers. You find that often, right? You know, so-and-so brothers logging, right? So that's quite common, or was. I mean, it still probably is. A lot of these are family businesses that are kind of handed down, inherited in a way. Even if the business isn't inherited, the vocation kind of is. And they were somewhat limited. You know, the fellers were all on foot pretty much. And there was only so much work they could do. You know, the skidders were smaller. Like, everything kind of was smaller. And I appreciated, especially as a young adult, as I started to explore more on my own, and I wasn't just going up into the bush with my dad and my brother to harvest some standing dead trees or some of the waste from other logging operations for firewood. And that's typically what we did. We would try to find somewhere that had been logged, a cut block, and they would often leave some waste, and as long as it wasn't full of sand, the wood itself, you know, being dragged through the gravel, then we would harvest that. You know, we don't want to dull our chainsaw chain. That gets expensive. But once I was coming up on my own, I really appreciated all of these logging roads, even the old ones that have since sort of become overgrown, because they're still often accessible. Maybe you need to take a a pair of pruning shears with you, which I have in the back of the truck, and a handsaw and a few things like that if you really want to get in. But the sides of my truck are all bruised from all the saplings scraping against the side. I'll push my way in to some places, and often I'll hike, or I'll take I've got an ATV, a small one, medium-sized one, not one of these big ones. Like, everything's bigger right now. And I've appreciated the opportunity to come to some of the places that I can visit and experience that. And I know I owe that, in large part to the logging industry, making these roads. And of course, we all enjoy lumber, paper products, whatever else is a byproduct of the logging industry. But about 5 years ago or so, I became fully aware of the change in the technology and the change in the industry. And it's probably narrowing margins. And I mean, it's probably a catch-22. Why are the margins narrowing on their profitability? Well, probably because they're spending more and more money on very expensive equipment. And they probably justify the equipment initially by saying, well, we can harvest so much more, which they can. And then, of course, the payments go up, so then the margins get narrow. So then they got to, now you really got to produce. And if there's any hard times, a difficult year or something like that, then they feel a crunch. But I've started to notice, of course, more aggressive. It seems to me, I could be wrong, this is all pretty much anecdotal, larger cut blocks, clearly overwinter harvesting, which is probably the biggest. The biggest change I've noticed in the area that I go is, it used to be when I would come up in November to the areas that I can still reach, I would go up into the snow line and a bit beyond and, get to the point where I might risk getting stuck, and then I would stop there. When I came up at that time of year, what I saw was what I was going to see in spring. Because when I come back up in the spring, I don't ride snowmobile or anything like that, so I'm not up here in the winter. When I would come up in the spring, I would be either right before fall breakup is sort of ended, so that they're not really hauling logs, or very, very close to it anyway. And so there wouldn't be any fresh logging either. But of course now, when I come up in the spring, I'm dazzled by what they've done over the winter that I didn't see. And of course, these harvesting machines are massive. And so there are several things that go along with that as well. And that really is a question of stewardship. I find it odd in this time of increasing sort of environmental awareness. And I think a lot of it is well-founded and a lot of it is not. I think a lot of it has overtones of people seeking differential advantage, mostly, central type politicians, globalists, those type of people, seeing an opportunity to control the populace. And some of it is well-founded. There are definitely, I've been sort of a environmentally minded person since I was, I guess, consciously aware of such things, very early teens, if not before. I remember as a kind of an automotive enthusiast from a young age, I got a couple of different car magazines, and there's one I'll always remember, and it was pollution controls or smog controls. Rob your engine of power, get rid of them, and they had article after article on how to remove all the emission control devices from the early 70s cars. That's what they were focusing on. And I remember at that time researching alternative fuels and being like, I like this magazine, but you're off the mark here. And I stopped buying it. Money was precious then too. So if I was working hard, gathering bales of hay for a farmer or working up in the bush, I wasn't going to spend it on something that I felt was immoral. And I had early on developed a sense in myself that I thought, whether we're overpopulated now or not, there is an equilibrium there to be had, after which point I think the earth is going to struggle to sustain the human population in many different ways. And obviously there are many different arguments that can be made on all sides of the fence. And we're not really engaged in those discussions, I don't think. The arguments seem to be more along the lines of, guilt people for really living in the first world in a way. And that would include people who have their eyes on living in the first world who don't yet. And opportunists who see an opportunity to control other people with these kind of narratives. Now, having said that, the reason I bring that up is not to get controversial in this video, because I think a broad perspective on all of that is a healthy thing, and to be aware of things is a healthy thing. But the reason I bring that up is it's odd to me, in light of all of that, to see what I see as a very softly regulated industry, at least in my area. Now, I'm not suggesting that they're not well regulated. However, the regulation doesn't seem to be that tight. There are areas of British Columbia that have burned, of course, as everybody knows. And this isn't just this year or 2021, but we're going back many years. I mean, that is a normal thing. It's less normal than it was because, of course, the majority of forest fires are human caused, whether incidental, accidental, or intentional. But, of course, with the increase in fires, that does tell you, and I'm talking year over year, not every year, et cetera, but with the increasing numbers and the increasing sort of percentage of them that are human caused, that tells you something there. But with that damage, and in a somewhat natural cycle, but of course it's not that natural when we increase the fire damage. Burn acreage is a different thing because, of course, we put a lot of fires out. So there's differences there. However, the point I'm making, tangent, the point that I'm making is there are specific areas of BC that have burnt, and they have got industry working in the very same area. Entire mountains, named mountains that go right from the foothills up to a massive mountain, all the way around this mountain. They've got industry working, and then there's a huge fire, and they let the fire go mostly because it's not near any kind of habitation, and it's working its way up a box canyon. There's really nowhere for it to go. Once it runs up into the alpine, all that's left is rock and glaciers, and those don't burn. So you kind of let it go. But what, of course, what happens though is it depletes all the greenery in that area, and it leaves it vulnerable to evaporation and landslides and all those issues. And they don't seem to adapt the forest management to reflect this fire. Now, they probably do. I don't trust government for just about anything. And so I'm willing to give the benefit of the doubt, kinda, but I don't trust that. I probably will get in touch with some people. I've sort of been meaning to for years to discuss this, because the stewardship, is on that side, the sort of regulatory side. Like, how are we not letting, let's say, this particular valley, how are we not letting it recuperate? Because the cut blocks seem to be getting larger. There's a lot of activity in the area, lots of new roads being put in. I saw several new roads today on my way up here. Luckily, up where I'm going is a place that I go often. I go usually every year. I call it my perch. I see they've deactivated the road. It's all ditched. So that's nice because I know that they're not planning on working up here for a while at least. But there's new roads down below. How do we not let these areas recuperate? There's less and less green space in between the margins of the cut blocks and the recently burned timber. I don't really understand. And then, of course, on the stewardship side is the way in which the industry seems to leave some of these cut blocks. They'll pile up these big slash piles. And of course, if you go on an industry website, I can't find the one I was on. I wish I had bookmarked it or screenshotted it a couple of years ago, because they were making claims about carbon neutral, carbon zero, and zero waste. And every time I go by a big pile of wood that has not been burned, you know, it's these big slash piles, they're supposed to burn them in the winter, you know, after they, and I'll come across, I'm constantly, and I've taken a lot of photos of them, I'm constantly coming up to piles of wood that should have been burned, and they're gray, silver, right? These piles, they're silver. That tells me they're not coming to burn them because they've weathered for a number of years to get that, you know, sort of go from brown to slowly gray, and eventually they'll turn silver. They're almost, the wood will almost become white. If it's out in the sun, it just bleaches like crazy. It's a neat color, actually, very satiny, but, and there's a lot of places that I frequent, and I've been, you know, I'll come across a place that's got this silvery wood pile, several of them, and I'll call them, oh, look, there's some zero waste now, right? I mean, that's silly, obviously. If they were zero waste, all of that would be taken and it would be chipped up for something or whatever. Don't claim zero waste. And I think at some point you're going to find all the claims of carbon neutrality made by corporations and governments. You're going to find that if anybody did the slightest auditing of that it's bullshit. And this is just another virtue signaling. All I got to do to get past the hurdles in front of me is to make a claim of carbon neutrality. We'll, you know, make a couple of measurements and call it a day. And who really wants to audit that, because, you know, it's going to be unpopular to not be carbon neutral. Anyway, another tangent, but I'm doubtful. I'm dubious of that claim. So I see all these unprocessed slash piles, you know, and the problem with those, of course, is that's not a natural occurrence. When I go up into the bush, I spent a bunch of time up there today. It's nice, deep, dark woods with some big old cedar trees, which got a really nice texture on their bark. So I'm rambling around in there with a DSLR and a tripod trying to capture some images. Where the trees fall in the forest, they fall one or two here and there, and of course they slowly rot and break down and they become the new topsoil. And it's very natural, and there's not a lot of disruption to the forest floor because it's only so many, you know, square inches of coverage. We have a huge pile that's as big as a house. How long does that take to break down? Now, maybe you could make an argument that that's carbon sequestration and it's a habitat for small animals, but then why do we burn them? I mean, you know, why are they burned then? And then, of course, I see lots of garbage, and I see lots of, I get it, on these cut blocks, they're steep, they've got big holes and ruts and all kinds of upturned, there's all kinds of upheaval. And I have a hard time imagining that forested area looked like that before there was ever heavy equipment in there. Now, I'm not saying they need to manicure it, but I think that there's zero fucks given as to what kind of you know, geoengineering we're doing, you know, unintentionally, I guess, intentionally and unintentionally. And then the garbage. I leave 1/4 window open on my truck so I can throw the grease tubes and the other things that I find around all these sites. Last week I was up at another spot, very pretty spot, and there's more of these unprocessed piles, and there are slash piles, and then there's other wood that's pushed over a bank and it's all fallen down into the valley below. Huge piles. I mean, just piles of wood. Another bunch of zero waste, right? And some of these are big timbers. Some of them got paint markings on them like they were supposed to be for something. You know, they'll be marked 1, 2, whatever. They'll have triangles on them. I don't know their symbol system that they use, but some of these look like they might have been some good timbers. Why they were rejected, I don't know, but they were clearly, deliberately pushed off the bank. I see that everywhere as well. Huge piles of logs pushed off over a bank. Out of sight, out of mind, I guess. I don't know. Then they don't have to make a slash pile out of that one and burn that one too. But there was a big slash pile the other day that I went to, and it's been there for a couple of years. I know the pile. It's been there for at least 3 years probably. And I have my doubts that they're coming back to deal with it, because up around the corner, it's not very far, it's like a kilometer, there's another landing, and there was some slash up there, and that's been burned. So if it was the same operation, I don't understand why they wouldn't burn this other one as well. But either way, I think somebody thinks they're going to burn it because there was a bunch of boxes there, a whole bunch of boxes, large corrugated boxes, like tall ones, really tall. By really tall, I mean like probably 18 inches tall, maybe slightly more, but pretty tall for a cardboard box, and pretty large as well. With the name of a nursery. I'm going to guess a tree nursery. I'm guessing that these were brought up to the bush as part of a tree planting operation on some of these cut blocks that have been logged recently. But they're all just thrown at the base of the slash pile. I don't know. Maybe that's fake ecology to not like to see what would otherwise be biodegradable litter up in the bush. Maybe that's not really an important thing. Maybe what's more important is just how much the industry seems to have expanded with these large harvesting machines, and the intensity that comes with the thinner margins and the higher capital outlay to be part of the game. And it seems to be unabated here. And then, of course, there's the heli logging, which again ups the ante. I think it must in terms of cost, which there's been lots more heli logging. This has all been within the sort of 5 years. Now, I will say, going back almost 10 years now, I did see my first sort of cable logging operation. Right there on a very steep slope, and they were working. I was watching them from across the valley. They were working a steep slope where there had been a burn, and it was just this big burned patch. Large. Was probably, I don't know how large the spot was, probably 100 acres or more, but a very steep slope. And I watched them, cut the roads in. There were about 4 roads, partway each sectioning up the hillside. And then you could see them, with the binoculars or whatever, I could see them hauling the logs up to one of the benches where the road was, and they would come and pick them up there. So that's a pretty big operation, really, compared to the way it had always been done before. I've spoken to old timers who knew when they were young, the old timers who used to come in on horseback and bushwhack their way in to survey for roads to come into a cut block, right? And they would camp overnight and everything with their horses. It would take them a week to go in and survey a road before they would bring in what in those days was a heavy equipment, which was pretty light by today's standards. And yet at the same time, I watched a documentary, a YouTube documentary, you can find it probably if you search for it, on the logging industry in Merritt, British Columbia, and how they've all been basically shut down, and a lot of them are worried about sort of going under because they're not making any money. They can't pay their equipment loans and that sort of thing. So I don't know what's going on there, and they can't get any answers. They don't know why, which I can imagine is pretty frustrating. Anyway, I remember one time when I made another video and I was talking about forestry practices and stewardship and the way I think sometimes industry treats the public resource, and the way the management is done on the government side and those kind of things. And a couple of people had responded. One in particular that I recall, and it may have even been more than one, was referring to Vancouver Island and how the logging companies there have actually leased what we would in Canada call crown land. It's public land, owned by the Queen. But normally you can just go there, right? Any of these areas here I can just go. It's publicly accessible land. That they would lease the crown land, and then they would treat it as private property, and they actually could. In other words, I thought I was getting bit on the back by a horsefly. Very bug free out here, like wonderful. The odd horsefly, but I haven't had a horsefly since before lunch, and it's 4:30 now. But on these crown lands, they're treating it as private land. And so when they put up a sign, like a lot of the signs I see, let's say road construction ahead, unauthorized persons beyond this point, I take that as a suggestion. That's a company's sign. They don't indicate a law or anything like that, or an authority, right? It's just their own sign they've had made up. And that's why I'm up on a Saturday, because normally they'll have the radio channel on the sign, and I would call ahead for everybody's safety if I had a radio with me, but I don't, so that's why I came up on a weekend. But apparently there, you know, if they have leased the land and they could treat it as private property, they could put up no trespassing signs, and those aren't just, if you go here you'll be trespassed. You are trespassing, even though it's Crown land. And they're much more aggressive. So I'd be interested to hear from any of you who have any knowledge or experience, or are from Vancouver Island or anywhere else in BC, on the state of the logging industry. You know, I mean, obviously it's a resource that we all make use of to one degree or another, directly or indirectly. So it's a little bit hypocritical to just say, you know, I don't want any of it. But obviously proper management and especially of the forests themselves, of the resource itself, you know, especially in light of the fires and the dislocation of wildlife. There's so much to it, right? Having said all of that, I'm going to go, because that's too much and too long and too rambling, and I apologize for that. I do want to say, by signing off, I did have a wonderful day in the bush. You hear that? It's nothing. It's dead silent except the sound of the air in the trees. And I can hear the creeks way down in the valley floor below, way down there. Just a distant white noise. It's been fantastic all day, very quiet. So I'm happy about that. I had a good day and got some relaxation and took some photographs and pondered life and all of that good stuff. Let me know what you think. Thanks for watching.